Ever feel like no matter how much you study, the information just doesn't stick?
Yeah, like you're just going through the motions.
Exactly. It's frustrating, right? Spending hours with your notes, but then drawing a blank on exam day.
Ah, tell me about it. Happens to the best of us.
Well, that's why I'm so excited about today's deep dive. We're going to be looking at Study Smart, effective techniques for academic success, this podcast I came across. And let me tell you, it's packed with actionable tips to help us ditch the cramming and actually learn, remember, and use what we study.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Passive learning just doesn't cut it, that's for sure.
Right. So let's jump right in. One of the key concepts the podcast emphasizes is active recall. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I've come across it, but honestly, I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
Well, basically, instead of just passively reading or rereading your notes, you're actively trying to retrieve the information from your memory.
Oh, so it's like testing yourself, right?
Exactly.
Hmm.
The podcast compares it to walking through a forest. Every time you recall a piece of information, you're creating a path.
And the more you walk that path, the clearer and more defined it becomes.
Got it. So it's like building a mental muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Exactly. And there are so many ways to practice active recall. Flashcards are a classic, but you could also answer practice questions.
Or summarize information aloud, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or even try teaching the concept to someone else.
Ooh, I like that idea. Explaining something to someone else really forces you to solidify your understanding.
Right. And speaking of solidifying understanding, that actually ties in nicely with the next technique, the Cornell note-taking method.
Okay, now you're talking. I've heard good things about this method.
It's awesome. So instead of just taking notes in a traditional paragraph-style format, you divide your page into 3 sections.
3 sections, I get
You've
it.
got your notes section where you jot down the main ideas. Then there's a cues section.
Cues, what goes in there?
So in the cues section, you'd write down key terms, important questions, or anything that prompts your memory. So like if I'm taking notes on photosynthesis, I might write, what are the reactants of photosynthesis?
Perfect. And finally, there's the summary section at the bottom, where you synthesize the main points into a concise overview.
So it's like you're creating your own mini study guide right there in your notes. I love it.
Exactly. And by summarizing, you're engaging in active recall right from the get-go.
Makes total sense. And then when it's time to review, you can just cover up the main notes section and use the cues to quiz yourself. Brilliant.
Right. It's way more effective than just passively rereading pages and pages of notes. Speaking of making things memorable, the podcast also talked about this crazy technique called a memory palace. Ever heard of that?
Memory palace.
Yeah.
Rings a bell, but I'm drawing a blank on the specifics.
Well, it basically involves leveraging your spatial memory. So you take a familiar place like your home and you mentally associate information with different locations within that space.
Okay, so let's say I'm trying to remember the steps of photosynthesis.
Perfect example. You could imagine sunlight entering the plant at your front door, chlorophyll absorbing light energy in your living room, and so on.
Whoa, that's wild. So you're saying I could, like, memorize a grocery list by placing items around my kitchen?
Exactly. The more vivid and unusual the associations, the better.
I gotta try this. But isn't it easy to, like, get lost in your own memory palace?
Not really, because you're using a space that's already deeply familiar to you. It just takes a little practice to map everything out.
I can see how that would be super helpful, though, for memorizing lists, processes, anything, really. Okay, what else did this podcast cover?
All right, last but not least, we've got spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition. Now that one I have heard of. Isn't that like reviewing stuff at increasing intervals?
Yep. So instead of cramming all your studying into one massive session, you space it out over time.
Which kind of goes against everything we're taught about studying, right? I mean, who hasn't pulled an all-nighter before a big exam?
Oh, I've been there.
Yeah.
But the thing is, cramming just doesn't lead to long-term retention.
Right. It's like building a house of cards. Looks impressive for a minute, then poof.
Exactly. Space repetition, on the other hand, is like building a solid foundation brick by brick. You review something the next day, then 3 days later, then a week later, and so on.
So you're basically reinforcing those neural pathways over time, like giving your brain a chance to really absorb the information.
Precisely. The podcast even mentioned that studies have shown that spaced repetition can lead to a 200% increase in long-term retention compared to cramming.
200%. That's insane. I'm definitely going to have to give this a try.
Me too. I don't know about you, but I feel like this deep dive has been a total game changer. It's amazing how much science actually goes into effective learning.
Totally. And I love how the podcast really emphasized that Studying smart is about working smarter, not harder.
Couldn't agree more. It's all about finding the techniques that work best for you.
Right, because everyone learns differently. Experimentation is key.
Exactly. So as we wrap up here, I want to leave you with this. We've been focusing on academics, but these techniques can be applied to so much more than just studying.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Learning a new language, picking up a new skill, even just remembering where you put your keys.
Right. These principles can make a huge difference in all areas of life.
It makes you wonder how much more we could all achieve if we really harness the power of these techniques.
Food for thought, right. And hey, who knows, maybe we'll deep dive into some of those applications in future episodes.
Now, that would be interesting. I'm already looking forward to it.
Me too. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Until next time, happy learning.
Happy learning.